Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the July 2020 format. Now, the new directive from Konami states that organized play is suspended until further notice, which is a bit of a bummer, but that doesn't mean there isn't an online environment that is alive and thriving. I mean, that's basically all we have to go by when it comes to playing Yu-Gi-Oh! So for the better of yourself, your friends, your family, and your neighbors, be sure to stay home and play online. So this video is going to be the top 5 decks you can expect, whether you want to play any of these decks, or if you want to prepare to beat any of these decks in the online environment, and that way you're going to be best prepared and equipped to know what you're going to be going up against. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So kicking things off with number 5, we have a deck that is going to stomp out the competition, and I'm going to run out of dinosaur jokes eventually, but that deck is, of course, Dinosaur. Now, this deck is still alive and kicking. When it comes to Dinosaur, it's a very solid going second deck. I mean, it is able to play a bunch of cards that can either slow the opponent down or basically just nullify everything the opponent did and then just OTK with ease. I mean, with so much aggressive power in this deck, and it can do it relatively consistently, there's a reason why this deck has been seeing so much success. Obviously, it's not perfect because it would be number 1 on this list if it weren't, but the thing is, when it comes to Dinosaur, it can also go first pretty well too, depending on how you build it. Worst case scenario, you're going to end on what, like Logia or Dolka plus like an Ultimate Conductor Tyranno? That's still pretty good. Maybe have a hand trap or 2 in your hand as well. If you're playing the True King version, you can actually end on True King of all Calamities, which is nice. We know how much of a beast that card is. Honestly, should be banned, but that's for another video. But nonetheless, Dinosaur has still been able to continuously just do well format after format from these past several months, and you're going to still expect to see a decent amount of it. So when it comes down to it, Dinosaur is still doing what it does best, and that is crushing the competition. And so for those reasons, that's why I gave it my number 5 spot. But coming in at number 4, we have yet another deck that has just managed to continuously persist format after format since its inception, and that is Salomon Great. Yes, this deck is still alive and well. What's nice about Salomon Great is that it's able to mold itself to any particular metagame, and for this metagame in particular that's very combo heavy, it's able to play a plethora of hand traps, anywhere in the neighborhood of like 12 to sometimes 15, but you're still able to access your 1 and 2 card combos that are going to get you to where you have to be. And while you may not have the most intimidating boards, this deck wants to play the mid to late game. And if you are able to drag your opponent and slow them down just enough that you're able to take over, that is where you're going to see this deck excel. Salomon Great plays the cards like the hand traps, in some instances the floodgates, to be able to slow the opponent down to their tempo and to be able to capitalize on that by being the strong recursive deck that it is. It can play the control game if it has to. It can get overly aggressive now with cards like Axis Code Talker, but even without that, you've still got Trans Code Talker OTKs and your Zeroboros OTKs in addition to that, thanks to in part to Update Jammer. It's just a really good all-around deck. Being able to push out all the other rogue decks because it can really just do anything it has to. It's just a very flexible deck, and that's why a lot of players like to play it. And so for those reasons, that's why I gave Salomon Great my number 4 spot. Now, coming in at number 3, we actually have a new contender on the list, and that is Dragon Link. Now, there's 2 different ways you can go about this, and we're going to talk about both of those. One is with the FTK, and one is without. So first of all, yeah, there's an FTK in the format, and if that weren't enough, it is a 1-card FTK that has somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 95% success rate if your opponent does not have a hand trap. That sounds fun and interactive, right? So if you haven't already seen the video, I've already done it in depth with the innovators of this FTK, so I'd highly recommend you check out that video, but this deck is definitely here to stay. So what's interesting about the FTK portion of this deck is that aside from it being a unique incarnation that we've never seen before, it's able to set up a Herald of the Arclight before going into the full combo of the FTK. And why that matters is that if you don't preemptively hand trap them at certain opportunities, then once they get that Herald of the Arclight on the field, the hand traps are not going to help you. So it's interesting that it forces your hand to a degree, and you need to have specific ways to out it. Now, obviously, when you go into games 2 and 3, that's going going to change the dynamic of the game entirely, because you're going to have more cards either to stop the FTK or to kind of work around the fact that you know your opponent is playing it. But game one, anytime there's an FTK in the format, it must be respected. So obviously this was much more of a surprise factor when it was first discovered at LCS4, but it's going to continue to persist throughout this format for as long as this deck is going to be allowed to be played. Chaos Space being released in Toon Chaos gave this deck a huge boost, giving it even more consistency when it comes to achieving the FTK. And the thing is, and this is where we're going to pivot to the non-FTK version of the deck, because two players at LCS4 were piloting non-FTK versions of the same deck. The deck can just easily pivot to True King of all Calamities, which is basically like an FTK in its own right, and it doesn't really matter because unless you have very specific outs to a lingering skill drain, I don't really know what else you're going to be able to do. The deck is very combo heavy, it's very powerful, it's able to play through multiple hand traps, and it's a very, very solid deck at the moment. Now the thing is, and the reason why I have this at number 3 is because it hasn't been seeing that much representation. I'm not sure if that's just because the deck is difficult to pilot or because people are starting to catch on and it's not being as prevalent as a result of that, and so the surprise factor was really one of the reasons for this deck's success. However, this is a deck you're going to see a lot of. It's a deck that a lot of people are going to try to play as much as they can, because anytime there is a deck that literally says free wins, people are going to want to play it, they're going to want to exploit it, and you can bet you are going to see a lot of it. So be prepared going into any tournament you might be entering that this deck exists, and until we either get a ban list or another set of cards that's going to just completely power creep this out, we are going to be dealing with this for the next several months. So for those reasons, that's why I gave Dragon Link and Dragon Link FTK my number 3 spot. But coming in at number 2, we have a deck that has managed to stay at the top of the tier list for the last several months, and it has not gone anywhere since, and that is Antipater. I think one of the cool things about Antipater still being this high on the list is that people are still finding ways to constantly innovate this deck. One deck I want to show in particular is actually a Sekka's Light variant of the deck, and the reason I want to show this list in particular is because typically combo decks don't play lots of hand traps to combat other strategies, but I think that might change with Antipater moving forward, simply due to the fact that Dragon Link FTK now exists. Once an FTK enters the format, it completely changes the dynamic of how the game is played, and so a variant like this might be the way to go if the Dragon Link FTK is as popular as it should be. And so the thing is, even if it doesn't, you can just go back to playing the old version of Antipater, which is perfectly fine, but the cool thing is that Antipater is able to adapt even when there is an FTK in the format, and that's why it is still managed to be at the top of the tier list. Antipater has just been dominating the online scene. This deck is able to just be resilient playing through multiple hand traps. If you're able to get lucky off a Kwakimeru Guardian hit, you pretty much just won the game from there, and your opponent should just scoop up immediately, because a single Kwakimeru Guardian hit off any of the excavations of those Anticipators makes it brutally difficult for the opponent to be able to do much, because that's already one hand trap that they can possibly negate, not to mention that there's so many must negate type of cards like Gallant Granite giving you access to Block Dragon, there's Crystron Halki Fibrax is on top of it, there's Linkross, like it just keeps going on and on and on, and the advantage just keeps snowballing out of control. I mean, this is why the deck is so powerful, and yes, while it doesn't have an FTK necessarily, this is a deck that people have had a lot more time to play, are much more practiced in, and they're going to feel much more comfortable playing, and the online scene has reflected that there's going to be a lot of Antipater relative to the rest of the decks in the field. So in addition to everything else we've already talked about, you have to worry about this combo deck as well, and yeah, while it doesn't FTK necessarily, you're still going to end on a board that's near invincible for your opponent to deal with, and that's pretty much exactly why the deck is at the status that it is. So for all those reasons, Antipater is still going strong, and that's why I gave it my number 2 spot. Now before we get to my number 1 pick, I did have an honorable mention or two, and the first being Altergeist. Now that Multifaker is back at 3, people are just loving getting Altergeist reintroduced into the game, and yeah, it's a trap deck, but it's still able to compete because it can play a ton of hand traps, which is able to kind of just slow down some of these other decks just enough, and it's such a heavy control control deck that is able to keep those other decks in check. And going first, again, it's not able to combo off like crazy, but it is able to do some very devastating things on the board, and that's why you're having to see a ton of it in the online environment. Another one is Sky Striker. Sky Striker, again, is kind of having a bit of a fall from grace, but I think any deck that can main deck 14 hand traps and be able to still play proficiently through any of the shenanigans that are going on currently with these top 5 decks, I definitely think that is worthy of a mention. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 meta deck of the July 2020 format. And if you haven't already figured it out, we are going once again with Eldritch. Now, again, when it comes to Eldritch and Antipater, and even by extension Dragon Link at this point, I think all 3 of these decks are kind of clustered together and just like a tier above literally everything else. Like there is just a chasm between those decks and the entirety of the rest of the format. But nonetheless, when it comes to Eldritch specifically, the one reason why I had this at number 1 over something like, let's say, Antipater or Dragon Link is solely due to the fact that there is tons of representation when it comes to Eldritch. This is probably going to be the deck you're going to be encountering the most in the online environment, so this is probably what you're going to want to prepare for the most. Now, the thing is, you need to consider all the decks we discussed, but Eldritch specifically has a lot of different variants that you have to cover. You have to worry about the pure version, which doesn't see as much play now, but still something that some people like to mess around with. The invoked version, which is really nice because it may not be as explosive as the synchro version, which we'll talk about in a minute, is able to main deck a pretty decent amount of hand traps, and it's still relatively good for what the deck is. And then we have Synchro Eldritch. Of course, we're going to have another combo deck at the top, but the reason why I have this deck at the top is because all of its combos originate from a single card. Yes, you need a discard too, so it's really a 2-card combo, but it doesn't even matter. And the thing is, if your opponent has no way to interact with you, you are basically just going to win the game. Like, it's game over. At the very least, your opponent's going to set up multiple negations, and at worst, they're going to draw several cards and end on a true King of all calamities. The deck not only has this combo aspect to it, but it can also play the control game. So even if the combo half of the deck fails, you're still playing regular Eldritch. You're still playing all of the powerful recursive cards that Eldritch has at its disposal. And so being this two-headed deck of sorts that it can kind of play either game, and not only makes it difficult to play against, it makes it difficult to sideboard for, and it's still a very resilient deck. All of these decks that we've talked about are very strong in their own right, but just solely due to the fact that it seems like in the online environment that Eldritch is just absolutely everywhere. Also Antipater and Dragon Link, but I think just to a slightly less degree. Those are the reasons why I put Eldritch as my number 1 slot. But again, you could put Antipater up there too. I wouldn't really fret you for it. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top decks moving into this format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.